Hello, everyone. Before we begin tonight's journey into the frozen unknown, if you enjoy stories like this, tales that let you drift into another world where survival meets silence and the cold becomes a companion, please subscribe to the channel. These narratives are crafted to help you relax, reflect, and perhaps even fall asleep to the sound of distant winds and quiet courage. Now, settle in, dim the lights, and let me take you somewhere far from here. As soon as the mist rose, the riders followed the sound in the stone courtyard. It came without warning, that sound, a low, rhythmic echo that seemed to pulse from beneath the frozen earth itself. The mist had arrived just before dawn, rolling in from the north like a living thing, swallowing the landscape in gray silence. And then, as if the fog had been waiting for the right moment, the sound began. Hoofbeats, perhaps, or something older. Something that didn't belong in a place this remote, this abandoned. The courtyard was ancient. Its stones had been laid centuries ago by hands long since turned to dust, part of a fortress that time and ice had reclaimed. The riders had stumbled upon it 2 days earlier, seeking shelter from the relentless Arctic wind that scoured the plateau like a blade. They were 5 in total. Thomas, the leader, a man in his early 40s with a weathered face and steady hands. Beside him rode Margaret, quiet and observant, her eyes always scanning the horizon. Then came David, younger, eager, still learning the patience that survival demanded. Elena brought up the rear with William, both experienced enough to know when to speak and when to stay silent. They had been traveling for weeks, pushing north through a landscape that seemed designed to resist human presence. This was the far edge of the known world, a place where maps grew vague and distances lost meaning. They were not explorers in the grand sense. They were survivors, refugees in a way, from a southern plague that had emptied cities and turned familiar roads into graveyards. North had seemed like the only direction left, but the north, they were learning, had its own rules. The mist thickened as they stood in the courtyard, their breath adding to the vapor that surrounded them. The sound continued, steady and rhythmic, echoing off the stone walls that rose on 3 sides. It was impossible to tell where it originated. Sound behaved strangely here. The cold air carried it farther than it should, bending it around corners, reflecting it off ice and rock until every direction seemed equally likely. Thomas raised his hand, signaling for silence. Not that anyone was speaking. They had learned weeks ago that voices carried dangerously far in the stillness of the Arctic. Sound was a luxury, rationed carefully, used only when necessary. The horses shifted beneath them, uneasy. Animals always knew first when something was wrong. What they couldn't see yet was that the courtyard was not as abandoned as it appeared. Margaret dismounted first, her boots crunching softly on the frost-covered stones. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that every action in this environment carried weight. One misstep could mean a twisted ankle, and a twisted ankle could mean death. There were no rescues here. No one was coming. Help was a concept that belonged to warmer, more populated places. Here you relied on yourself and the few people traveling beside you. She approached the nearest wall, running her gloved hand along the stone. It was old, older than anything they had encountered so far. The masonry was precise, fitted together without mortar in a way that suggested skill and patience. Whoever had built this place had intended it to last, and it had. Despite the ice that coated every surface, despite the wind that had worn smooth edges into the exposed stone, the structure remained intact, waiting. The sound shifted slightly, growing fainter, as if retreating deeper into the complex. Thomas dismounted as well, motioning for the others to stay mounted and ready. David looked like he wanted to argue, his youth making him restless, but a glance from Elena kept him quiet. William simply watched, his expression unreadable beneath the layers of fur and wool that protected him from the cold. The fortress, if that's what it had been, extended beyond the courtyard. Archways led into shadow, corridors disappeared into darkness. The mist made it impossible to see far, reducing visibility to a few dozen feet at most. Thomas and Margaret exchanged a look. They had survived this long by being cautious, by never rushing into the unknown without consideration. But they also knew that shelter was rare this far north, and winter was tightening its grip with every passing day. The temperatures were dropping, the winds were growing stronger. They needed a place to rest, to recover, to wait out the worst of what was coming. But something about the sound troubled them both. It felt deliberate, almost like a summons, and neither of them liked following invitations they didn't understand. The cold here was different from anything they had experienced before. It wasn't the sharp, biting cold of a winter storm that attacked exposed skin and stole breath. This was deeper, more patient. It seeped through layers of clothing, finding every gap, every seam, settling against the body like a second skin. It didn't rush. It didn't need to. Time was on its side. The longer you stay still, the more it claimed you. Margaret knew this instinctively. She had grown up in the Northern Territories, where winter lasted 8 months, and summer was a brief, almost apologetic interruption. She understood cold the way sailors understand tides, not as an enemy to be fought, but as a force to be respected, anticipated, and navigated. The others deferred to her judgment on matters of temperature and survival. She rarely spoke, but when she did, people listened.
She turned back to the group now, her voice low. "The sound is moving, deeper inside." Her breath fogged in the air, each word visible for a moment before dissolving. "We should follow it, but carefully. Stay together. Watch where you step." Thomas nodded. He trusted her instincts. David looked excited, the prospect of discovery briefly overwhelming his caution. Elena and William remained neutral, waiting to see what would unfold. They had learned long ago not to waste energy on anticipation. The Arctic taught patience to those who survived it. They secured the horses near the entrance, sheltered beneath an archway that offered some protection from the wind. The animals would be fine for a short time, though they couldn't be left indefinitely. Horses were resilient, but the cold here tested every living thing equally. As the group moved deeper into the fortress, the temperature dropped further. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The stone walls blocked the wind, which should have made it warmer. Instead, it felt colder. Stone remembered winter, holding it long after the air outside had softened. These walls had been cold for centuries. They would remain cold long after the riders were gone. The sound continued ahead of them, always just out of sight, leading them through corridors that twisted and turned in ways that seemed almost intentional. The mist followed them inside, curling along the floor, rising to chest height in places. Visibility remained poor. They moved slowly, hands outstretched, testing each step before committing weight to it. And then, without warning, the sound stopped. Silence rushed in to fill the void, sudden and absolute. It was disorienting, like losing your balance on flat ground. The absence of sound felt heavier than the sound itself had been. They stood in a wide corridor, walls rising on either side, disappearing into shadow above them. The mist pooled around their feet, thicker here, almost liquid in its density. Thomas held up a hand again, though no one was moving. They waited, listening. The silence stretched, pressing against their ears in a way that made them want to speak just to break it. But they didn't. They waited, because that's what survival required. Patience, observation, the willingness to endure discomfort without rushing toward resolution. Minutes passed. Nothing changed. The cold continued its work, creeping through gloves and boots, finding skin despite every precaution. Margaret shifted her weight slightly, feeling the beginning of numbness in her toes. That was a warning sign. Numbness meant circulation was being restricted, blood retreating from extremities to protect the core. They couldn't stay still much longer. William was the first to notice the markings. He moved closer to the wall, brushing away a thin layer of frost with his glove. Beneath it, carved into the stone, were symbols. Not letters exactly, but deliberate marks, repeating in patterns that suggested meaning. He traced them with his finger, his brow furrowed. These weren't decorative. They were functional. A record of something. A warning, perhaps. Or instructions. David crouched down, examining the floor. More symbols here, laid into the stone itself, forming a path that led deeper into the complex. He looked up at Thomas, excitement barely contained. Someone lived here. Recently, maybe. These marks aren't that old. Margaret shook her head slightly. Not recently, but not ancient either. Maybe decades. Maybe a century. She studied the carvings more closely. These are navigational, markers to keep people from getting lost. She paused, considering. This place is bigger than it looks from outside. That realization settled over them slowly. If the fortress extended deep enough to require navigation markers, then they were standing at the entrance to something far more complex than they had anticipated. A simple shelter had turned into a labyrinth, and labyrinths, Margaret knew, were easy to enter and difficult to leave. Still, the alternative was going back outside, into the wind and cold, with nowhere to rest. Thomas made the decision. We go deeper, but we mark our path. No one separates. If we lose sight of each other in this mist, we may not find each other again. They continued forward, following the symbols carved into the floor. The corridor opened into a larger chamber, circular in shape,
with a domed ceiling that rose high above them. The mist thinned here, allowing them to see more clearly. The room was empty, stripped of furniture or decoration, but the floor was polished smooth, as if countless feet had worn it down over years of use. In the center stood a raised platform, also stone, with a shallow depression carved into its surface. The depression was filled with ice, perfectly clear, reflecting the dim light that filtered down from openings high in the dome. The sound began again, but this time it was different. Not hoofbeats, not footsteps. A hum, low and sustained, vibrating through the stone beneath their feet. It didn't come from any single direction. It seemed to rise from the floor itself, resonating through the chamber until the air felt thick with it. Elena moved toward the platform, drawn by curiosity. She knelt beside it, peering into the ice. Something was inside it. Not an object exactly. A shape. A shadow. She leaned closer, her breath fogging the surface, and for a moment she thought she saw movement. Just a flicker. Then it was gone. "Don't touch it," Margaret said quietly. Her voice carried a note of warning that stopped Elena cold. "We don't know what this place is yet." But David was less cautious. He climbed onto the platform, standing over the depression, staring down into the ice. "It's deep," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the domed space. "I can't see the bottom." Thomas joined him, more to ensure David didn't do anything reckless than out of curiosity.
He looked into the ice as well, and he understood what David meant. The ice was clear, almost unnaturally so, but it descended far deeper than the platform itself should allow. It was as if they were looking into a shaft that dropped straight down into the earth, frozen solid, but somehow still transparent. And then, as they watched, something moved far below. Not a shadow this time. Light. A faint bluish glow that pulsed once, then faded. William spoke for the first time in hours. "We should leave." But Thomas didn't move. He was transfixed, staring into the depths. The glow pulsed again, brighter this time, closer. It was rising. The hum intensified, no longer subtle, now loud enough to feel in their chests, vibrating through bone and muscle. The glow continued to rise through the ice, growing brighter with each pulse. It wasn't steady. It flickered, like a flame struggling against wind, but it never went out. And as it climbed, the ice around it began to crack. Not loudly, not dramatically, just thin lines spreading outward from the center, spiderwebbing across the surface. The cracks didn't break through, they simply appeared, as if the ice itself was responding to the presence of whatever was moving beneath it. Margaret grabbed Elena's arm, pulling her back from the platform. "Everyone, step away, now." Thomas and David climbed down quickly, rejoining the group near the edge of the chamber. They watched as the light continued its slow ascent, now only a few feet below the surface. The cracks deepened, and frost began to form along their edges, white against the clear ice. The temperature in the chamber dropped further. Breath became visible even at a distance from the platform. The cold intensified, focused now, radiating outward from the depression like heat from a fire, but in reverse. The light reached the surface. It hovered there, just beneath the final layer of ice, pulsing steadily. And then, without warning, it stopped. The hum ceased. The cracks froze in place. Silence returned, heavier than before. No one spoke. No one moved. They stood at the edge of the chamber, staring at the platform, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The light remained, suspended beneath the ice, no longer rising, no longer fading, simply present. After what felt like an eternity, Thomas exhaled slowly. "We need to find another way out of here." But Margaret was already looking around the chamber, studying the walls. There were no other exits visible. The corridor they had entered through was the only opening. And now, as she glanced back toward it, she realized something that made her stomach tighten. The mist had thickened again, filling the corridor completely. They couldn't see more than a few feet into it. The path they had followed was gone, obscured by gray vapor that seemed to move with purpose, blocking their retreat. They were trapped, or at least, leaving the way they had come was no longer an option.
David's voice broke the silence, pitched higher than usual. "What is that thing?" No one answered, because no one knew. Thomas approached the platform again, more slowly this time, studying the light beneath the ice. It didn't react to his presence. It simply continued its steady pulse, rhythmic and patient. He knelt down, bringing his face close to the surface, and for the first time, he could see detail. The light wasn't a single source. It was composed of thousands of smaller points, clustered together,
moving in slow, coordinated patterns. It looked almost organic, like bioluminescence in deep water, but colder, sharper. There was intelligence in the movement, or at least the appearance of it. The patterns weren't random. They repeated, shifted, adapted. Watching them felt like watching thought itself made visible. Margaret joined him, crouching beside the platform. She said nothing for a long time, simply observing. Then, quietly, "I've heard stories from the old families about places like this." Thomas glanced at her. "What kind of stories?" "The kind people stop telling after a while. The kind that sound like myths until you're standing in front of something you can't explain." She gestured toward the ice. "The far north has always been strange. Even before the plague, before the migrations, there were travelers who went too far and found things they shouldn't have. Most never came back. The ones who did, they didn't talk much, but they built warnings, cairns, markers, symbols carved into stone." She paused. "Like the ones we followed to get here." William stepped forward, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "So this was a warning? And we ignored it?" "No," Margaret said. "I think this was a threshold, a boundary, and we crossed it." Elena, still standing near the edge of the chamber, spoke up. "Then how do we uncross it?" That was the question none of them could answer. The mist continued to block the corridor. The light continued to pulse beneath the ice, and the cold continued to deepen, pressing in from all sides, patient and relentless. Thomas stood, brushing frost from his gloves. "We explore. There has to be another way out. Buildings like this always have multiple exits." He looked around the chamber, studying the walls more carefully. "The symbols led us here. Maybe they lead somewhere else too." It was a reasonable plan. The only plan, really. Staying in the chamber indefinitely wasn't an option. The cold would claim them eventually, no matter how many layers they wore. Movement was survival. Stillness was surrender. They began to circle the chamber, running their hands along the stone, searching for seams, cracks, any indication of hidden passages. The walls were smooth, worn by time and cold, but not featureless. More symbols appeared at intervals, carved at chest height, spaced evenly around the circumference. They were different from the navigational markers they had followed earlier.
These were more complex, layered with detail. Margaret traced one with her finger, feeling the depth of the cuts. "These aren't directions," she said slowly. "They're descriptions. Records, maybe." She moved to the next symbol, comparing them. Each one is different. They're telling a story. David joined her, his excitement returning despite the circumstances. "Can you read them?" "Not exactly, but I recognize the structure. It's similar to the old carvings in the northern settlements. Before writing was common, people used symbols like these to record events, migrations, seasons, deaths." She moved along the wall, following the sequence. "This one shows cold, ice. This one shows people, a group traveling." She stopped at the next symbol, her expression shifting. "And this one shows something else, something that isn't people." Thomas moved closer. "What do you mean?" Margaret pointed to the carving. It depicted figures, humanoid in shape, but elongated, with limbs that didn't quite match human proportions. And beside them, more of those pulsing lights, rendered in stone but unmistakable. This shows them meeting whatever that is. She gestured toward the platform. And it doesn't show them leaving. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but understood. This place was a record, a warning, and possibly a tomb. They continued their circuit of the chamber, each symbol adding another piece to a story they were only beginning to understand. The carvings showed a progression, people arriving, settling, building. Then gradually, the symbols changed. The lights appeared more frequently. The human figures grew fewer. The final symbols in the sequence were almost abstract, showing only light and ice, with no human presence at all. William stopped at what appeared to be the last carving in the sequence. It was larger than the others, more elaborate. It showed the chamber they were standing in, rendered in simple lines but recognizable. In the center, the platform, and beneath it, descending deep into the earth, a vertical shaft filled with those same lights. At the top of the carving, above the chamber, another symbol, an open doorway, an exit. "There," William said, pointing. "That's the way out." But the doorway in the carving wasn't the corridor they had entered through. It was positioned opposite, on the far side of the chamber. They turned, looking at the wall where the exit should be. There was nothing there, just smooth stone, unbroken and solid. David approached it, running his hands over the surface, searching for seams. "There's no door here, it's solid." "Then the carving is wrong," Elena said. "Or it's older than the wall. Maybe the exit was sealed." Margaret shook her head. "Or maybe the exit is there, and we just can't see it." She studied the wall more closely, then turned back to the platform. The light beneath the ice was still pulsing, steady and rhythmic. "The stories I heard, they talked about places that changed, that revealed themselves only under certain conditions." She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what she was about to suggest. "What if the door only appears when the light is active?" Thomas frowned. "That doesn't make sense." "Nothing about this place makes sense," Margaret replied. "But we're here, and we need to leave. If the carvings are instructions, not just records, then maybe we're supposed to interact with it, with the light." The idea sent a chill through the group that had nothing to do with temperature. Interacting with something they didn't understand, something that felt both ancient and alive, went against every survival instinct they had developed. But the alternative was staying in the chamber until the cold or lack of supplies forced them into desperation. Thomas looked at each of them in turn. "If we do this, we do it carefully. No one touches the ice directly. No one acts without agreement from the group." He paused. "And if anything goes wrong, we retreat immediately." They moved back toward the platform, forming a loose circle around it. The light beneath the ice continued its steady pulse, seemingly unaware of their presence, or perhaps very aware and waiting. Margaret knelt beside the platform again, studying the ice more closely. The cracks that had formed earlier were still there, frozen in place, but they hadn't spread. The ice remained intact. She removed one glove, holding her bare hand a few inches above the surface. Immediately, the cold bit into her skin, sharp enough to make her fingers ache. But she kept her hand there, waiting, seeing if the light would respond. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the pulse quickened. Just slightly, but noticeably. The light brightened, and the cracks beneath her hand began to glow faintly, as if responding to the presence of her warmth. She pulled her hand back quickly, and the pulse slowed, returning to its original rhythm. "It reacts to heat," she said quietly, "to living warmth." David, always the quickest to act, stepped forward. "What if we all do it at once, all of us, around the platform?" Thomas considered this. It was risky, but not unreasonable. If the light responded to individual warmth, perhaps collective warmth would trigger a stronger response. And if the carvings were correct, that response might reveal the hidden exit. They positioned themselves evenly around the platform, each removing one glove. On Thomas's count, they lowered their hands simultaneously, hovering just above the ice. The reaction was immediate. The light surged, brightening dramatically, and the cracks across the entire surface began to glow. The hum returned, louder than before, resonating through the chamber with enough force to vibrate the floor beneath their feet. The ice didn't melt. Instead, it seemed to thin, becoming more transparent, more like glass than frozen water. And through it, they could see deeper into the shaft below. The lights weren't just floating randomly. They were arranged in patterns, spiraling downward, forming structures that looked almost architectural, pathways, chambers, a complex that extended far beneath the fortress, built not of stone, but of light itself. And then, across the chamber, exactly where the carving had indicated, the wall began to change. Stone that had appeared solid moments before started to fade, growing translucent, then transparent. Beyond it, another corridor, leading upward toward the surface, the exit. But as the doorway revealed itself, something else happened. The lights beneath the ice began to rise again, faster this time, surging upward toward the surface. The cracks deepened, spreading rapidly, and for the first time, the ice itself began to make sound, a low, groaning creak that suggested imminent collapse. "Move!" Thomas shouted. "To the exit, now!" They ran, abandoning the platform, racing toward the newly revealed doorway. Behind them, the ice shattered with a sound like thunder, fragments exploding upward, filling the chamber with a storm of frozen shards. The lights burst free, no longer contained, spreading outward in brilliant, pulsing waves. The temperature plummeted. Breath froze mid-exhalation. Exposed skin burned with cold so intense it felt like fire. They reached the corridor just as the lights filled the chamber behind them, turning everything into a blinding blue-white glow. They didn't look back. They ran, following the upward slope, trusting that the path would lead to the surface. The walls around them trembled, the hum grew deafening, and then, abruptly, it stopped. They emerged into daylight, or what passed for daylight in the Arctic. The sun hung low on the horizon, pale and distant, offering no warmth but at least providing visibility. The mist was gone. The courtyard was behind them, the fortress's entrance clearly visible. Their horses were where they had left them, somehow undisturbed, as if no time had passed at all. They stood in silence, breathing hard, the cold air burning their lungs. No one spoke for several minutes. They simply stared at the fortress, at the entrance they had stumbled through hours ago, processing what had just happened. Finally, William broke the silence. What was that? Margaret shook her head slowly. I don't know, but it's still down there. Whatever it is, it didn't leave. It just let us go. Thomas turned away from the fortress, looking north, where their journey was supposed to continue. The plateau stretched endlessly, white and featureless. The wind had picked up again, steady and cold, carrying snow in thin streams across the frozen ground. They had survived the fortress, but they were still in the middle of nowhere, with winter closing in and no shelter in sight. We keep moving, he said quietly. We find another place to rest, and we don't go inside any more abandoned structures without knowing what we're walking into. David laughed, a short, sharp sound that had little humor in it. Agreed.
They mounted their horses, securing gear and checking supplies. The encounter had cost them time, but nothing else. They were intact, alive. That was more than many could say this far north. As they prepared to leave, Elena glanced back one last time at the fortress. The entrance was dark, still and silent, giving no indication of what lay beneath. But she could have sworn, just for a moment, she saw a flicker of blue light deep in the shadows. She said nothing. Some things were better left unspoken. They rode north, leaving the stone courtyard and its mysteries behind, following the sound of the wind across the frozen plateau. The first day after leaving the fortress was difficult, but not impossible. The weather held, cold but clear, with visibility stretching for miles. They made progress, covering more ground than they had in the previous week. The landscape remained unchanged, white, flat, featureless, but at least it was predictable. No more surprises, no more unexplained sounds or lights beneath the ice. But the experience stayed with them, settling into silence. No one spoke about what they had seen. No one tried to explain it. They simply carried it, adding it to the growing collection of inexplicable things that survival in the far north demanded you accept without understanding. Margaret led the way, as she usually did, her sense of direction unerring, even in a landscape where every direction looked identical. She navigated by subtle signs, the angle of the wind, the texture of the snow, the way ice formed on exposed rocks. Thomas rode beside her, occasionally consulting the rough maps they carried, though he knew the maps were more symbolic than useful this far north. David, Elena, and William followed in a loose line, conserving energy, speaking only when necessary. The cold remained constant, neither worsening nor improving. It simply was. They had learned to dress for it, layering furs and wool in ways that trapped warmth close to the body while allowing enough movement to ride. Gloves were thick but flexible. Boots were lined with insulation but light enough to walk in if needed. Every piece of gear had been chosen carefully, tested through weeks of travel. Survival in the Arctic wasn't about grand gestures. It was about small, consistent decisions repeated daily. By evening, they found a place to camp, a shallow depression in the ground where snow had drifted into a natural windbreak. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They dismounted, setting up a small shelter using canvas stretched between poles driven into the frozen earth. The horses were tethered nearby, their breath steaming in the fading light. Fire was a challenge. Wood was non-existent here, so they relied on fuel they carried, compressed peat and animal fat, slow-burning and smoky but sufficient. Thomas coaxed a flame to life using flint and steel, his hands steady despite the cold.
Once the fire caught, they gathered around it, close enough to feel its warmth, but not so close that sparks became a danger. Dinner was simple: dried meat, hard bread, melted snow for water. It wasn't satisfying, but it was fuel. They ate in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The sky above them darkened gradually, stars appearing one by one, sharp and clear in the cold air. There were no clouds, no wind, just silence and the faint crackle of the fire. After eating, they took turns keeping watch, 2 hours each, rotating through the night. It was necessary, though they rarely encountered danger. The Arctic was empty of predators this far north. The cold itself was the only threat, and it didn't attack. It simply waited. Elena took the first watch, sitting near the fire, wrapped in furs, scanning the horizon. Nothing moved, nothing changed. The plateau stretched endlessly in every direction, bathed in pale starlight. She thought about the fortress, about the lights beneath the ice, about the symbols on the walls. What had they stumbled into? A tomb? A temple? Something else entirely? She didn't have answers, and she suspected no one did. The second day was harder. Clouds moved in overnight, low and heavy, obscuring the sun, and turning the world into a uniform gray. Visibility dropped. The temperature remained stable, but the lack of light made everything feel colder, more oppressive. They rode in silence, heads down, following Margaret's lead through the featureless landscape. By midday, the wind picked up, not violently, but steadily, pushing against them from the north, making progress slower. The horses struggled slightly, their hooves breaking through crusts of ice with each step. The riders leaned forward, shielding their faces from the wind, trusting the animals to keep moving. David, riding near the back, began to fall behind. His horse was limping slightly, favoring its front left leg. He pulled gently on the reins, bringing the animal to a stop, and dismounted to examine it. The others halted as well, waiting while he checked the hoof. A small stone had wedged between the shoe and the hoof, not serious, but painful enough to cause the limp. He removed it carefully, then remounted. The horse seemed fine, stepping normally again. But the delay cost them time, and time in the Arctic was a resource as precious as food or warmth. They continued onward, but the light was already beginning to fade. Days were short this far north, especially as winter deepened. They would need to find shelter soon, or risk riding in darkness, which was dangerous even in familiar territory. Margaret spotted the formation just as the sun disappeared behind the clouds. A cluster of large boulders, half buried in snow, jutting up from the plateau like broken teeth. It wasn't ideal, but it would provide some protection from the wind. They altered course, heading toward it, reaching the rocks just as the last light faded from the sky.
They set up camp quickly, working efficiently in the darkness. The fire took longer to light this time. The wind kept extinguishing the initial sparks, but eventually it caught and warmth began to spread. They huddled close, grateful for the shelter the rocks provided. The wind howled around the formation, but didn't penetrate. For the first time that day, they could relax slightly. William prepared a hot meal using melted snow and dried provisions. It wasn't much different from their usual fare, but the warmth made it feel luxurious. They ate slowly, savoring the heat as much as the food. Conversation was minimal. Exhaustion had set in, dulling curiosity and dampening energy. After eating, they assigned watches and settled into their bedrolls, piled with furs and blankets. Elena took the second watch, replacing Thomas around midnight. The fire had burned down to embers, glowing faintly in the darkness. She fed it carefully, adding just enough fuel to keep it alive without making it too bright. Light attracted attention, even in a place as empty as this. Not from predators, but from other travelers, if any existed, and not all travelers could be trusted. She sat with her back against one of the boulders, scanning the darkness. The wind had died down, leaving the night eerily quiet. Stars reappeared overhead, brilliant and cold. She watched them, tracing familiar constellations, finding comfort in their constancy. No matter how far north they traveled, the stars remained the same. That continuity mattered more than she had realized before this journey began. A sound broke the silence. Faint, distant, but distinct. Hoofbeats. Elena's hand moved instinctively to the knife at her belt. She listened, holding her breath. The sound repeated, rhythmic and steady, approaching from the south. Another traveler, or something else. She woke Thomas quietly, touching his shoulder. He was awake instantly, a survival skill honed through weeks of vigilance. She gestured toward the sound. He listened, nodding, then woke the others. Within moments they were all alert, weapons ready, eyes scanning the darkness. The hoofbeats grew closer.
Then, emerging from the shadows, a figure on horseback, a single rider, moving slowly, deliberately. As they approached the firelight, features became visible. A man, older, with a long beard streaked with gray, wearing furs similar to their own. He stopped at the edge of the camp, raising one hand in a gesture of peace. "May I approach?" His voice was rough, weathered, but calm. Thomas stood, positioning himself between the stranger and the rest of his group. "You can," slowly. The man dismounted, leading his horse forward. In the firelight, his face was deeply lined, marked by years of exposure to wind and cold, but his eyes were clear, intelligent, assessing them as carefully as they assessed him. He stopped a respectful distance away, making no sudden movements. "You're far from anywhere," he said simply.
"So are you," Thomas replied. The man smiled faintly. "Fair point." He glanced at their camp, at the rocks providing shelter, at the embers of their fire. "Heading north?" "Yes. I'd advise against it. Winter's coming harder than usual this year, and the northern plateau isn't safe." Margaret spoke up. "We just came from the north. We've been managing." The stranger's expression shifted slightly, something flickering in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or concern. "You came from the north? Past the stone courtyard?" Silence fell over the group. Thomas exchanged a glance with Margaret. How did this man know about the fortress? The stranger seemed to read their hesitation. "I know the place. I've been there. Years ago, when I was younger and more foolish." He paused. "Did you go inside?" No one answered immediately. Then William, ever practical, asked, "Who are you?" "My name is Samuel. I'm a trapper, or I was before the plague. Now I'm just someone trying to survive, same as you." He looked at each of them in turn. "But I've been in the north longer than most, and I've seen things that don't fit into easy explanations." Thomas studied him carefully. The man seemed genuine, but trust was earned slowly in the Arctic. Still, information was valuable, and anyone who had survived this long alone deserved at least a conversation. "We went inside," Thomas admitted. "We didn't stay long." Samuel nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had suspected. "Then you're lucky. Most who go inside don't come back out." He gestured toward the fire. "May I sit? I have information that might be useful to you, and in exchange, I'd appreciate the warmth of your fire for a few hours." Thomas considered this, then nodded. "You can sit, but you'll tell us what you know, and you'll explain how you found us out here." Samuel lowered himself carefully onto a rock near the fire, extending his hands toward the warmth. "I didn't find you. I saw your fire from a distance. Light carries far in the dark." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "As for the fortress, that place is old, older than anything else in the north. No one knows who built it or why, but the stories say it was meant as a boundary, a marker between the world we know and something else." Elena leaned forward. "Something else?" Samuel's expression grew serious. "The lights, the things beneath the ice, they're not human. They never were. But they're not hostile either, at least not in the way we usually think of hostility. They're more like guardians, or prisoners. Depends on how you look at it." He paused, staring into the fire. "The people who built the fortress, whoever they were trying to contain something, or maybe communicate with it. The symbols on the walls aren't just records, they're warnings, instructions, ways to navigate the boundary without crossing it completely." David, unable to contain his curiosity, asked, "What happens if you cross it?" He looked at him directly. "You don't come back, or if you do, you come back changed." Samuel's words hung in the cold air, settling over the group like fresh snow. No one spoke immediately. The fire crackled softly, and somewhere in the distance the wind resumed its low howl. Thomas poured hot water from a pot hanging near the flames, handing a tin cup to Samuel. The older man accepted it gratefully, wrapping his weathered hands around the warmth. "You said people come back changed," Margaret said carefully. "What does that mean?" Samuel sipped the water slowly before answering. "I only met one person who claimed to have gone deeper into the fortress than I did. This was years ago, maybe 15 winters past. He was a young man then, traveling with a group similar to yours. They had taken shelter in the courtyard, just like you did. And just like you, they heard sounds. They followed them." He paused, his gaze distant, remembering. "But they went farther, down into the shafts beneath the ice. They stayed for days,
maybe longer. Time moves strangely down there, he said. When they finally emerged, only 3 of the original 7 came back. And those 3, they weren't quite the same. They moved differently, spoke differently. It was subtle, but noticeable, like they had learned something they couldn't unlearn. William frowned. What happened to them? 2 of them disappeared within a year, walked off into the snow one night and never came back. The 3rd stayed in one of the southern settlements for a while. That's where I met him. He told me about the fortress, about the lights, about the feeling that something down there was watching them. He said it wasn't hostile, but it wasn't indifferent either. It was interested. Samuel's voice dropped lower. He told me that the lights weren't creatures. They were thoughts, consciousness without form. And when you spend too much time near them, they start to understand you, and you start to understand them. But human minds aren't built for that kind of understanding. It changes you. Elena shifted uncomfortably. Where is he now, the man you met? Samuel shook his head. He walked into a blizzard during a storm that should have passed quickly. His body was never found. Some say he chose to go, that he was drawn back to the fortress, back to the lights. The group absorbed this in silence. The story was unsettling, but it aligned with what they had experienced. The lights had responded to them, reacted to their presence. There had been intelligence in that response, even if it was unlike any intelligence they had encountered before. Thomas spoke carefully. You said the fortress is a boundary. If we keep heading north, are we moving toward whatever's on the other side of that boundary? Samuel looked at him seriously. Yes and no. The fortress isn't the only boundary. There are others, scattered across the far north. Some are marked clearly, others aren't. But they all serve the same purpose.
They define the edge of the world as we know it. He gestured vaguely northward. Beyond that edge, the rules change. Physics behaves differently. Time doesn't flow the same way, and the things that exist there don't exist the way we do. David, ever skeptical despite everything they had seen, asked, How do you know all this? You said you only went to the fortress once. Once was enough, Samuel replied. But I've talked to others. Trappers, travelers, the old families who have lived in the north for generations. They all have stories. Different details, but the same core truth. The far north is strange. It always has been. And anyone who stays there too long either dies or becomes part of that strangeness. He finished his water and set the cup down carefully. My advice? Turn back. Head south before winter locks you in. The plague may have emptied the south, but at least the world there makes sense. Up here, nothing is guaranteed. Margaret asked the question they were all thinking. Can we go around? East or west, avoiding the deepest north? Samuel considered this. Maybe. The boundaries aren't walls, they're zones. Areas where the strangeness is concentrated. If you're careful, if you pay attention to the signs, you might be able to navigate around them. But it's risky. And winter is coming. Even without the strangeness, the cold alone will kill you if you're caught in the open. Thomas looked at his group. Each face reflected the same mixture of exhaustion, uncertainty, and determination. They had come this far because the south was no longer safe. Turning back meant facing the same dangers they had fled, but continuing forward meant confronting mysteries they barely understood. We'll decide in the morning, Thomas said finally. After we've rested, after we've had time to think. Samuel nodded. Fair enough. May I stay until dawn? I'll share what supplies I have in exchange for warmth and rest. Thomas agreed. Samuel moved to the edge of the camp, settling into his bedroll near the fire, but at a respectful distance from the others. He fell asleep quickly, the exhaustion of long travel evident in how deeply he slept. The group took turns on watch as planned, but sleep came fitfully for most of them. The conversation with Samuel had reopened questions they had tried to set aside. What were they really heading toward? Was survival in the north even possible? And if they turned back, what were they returning to? By dawn, the sky had cleared slightly. The clouds remained, but breaks appeared, allowing pale sunlight to filter through. Samuel was already awake when Thomas stirred, sitting by the rekindled fire, preparing a simple breakfast from his own supplies. Morning, Samuel said quietly. Sleep well? Well enough, Thomas replied, which wasn't entirely true.
As the others woke and joined them, Samuel laid out a rough map he had drawn over the years, marking locations he knew, areas he had explored, and boundaries he had identified through experience and stories. It was crude but detailed, more useful than the formal maps they carried. "If you're determined to continue north," Samuel said, tracing a route with his finger, "I'd suggest heading northeast rather than due north. There's a valley system about 10 days from here that offers better shelter. The boundaries are further west, at least according to what I've heard. You might be able to skirt them entirely." Margaret studied the map carefully. "Have you traveled that route?" "Parts of it, not the whole thing, but I've talked to people who have." He paused. "It's not safe. Nothing up here is safe, but it's less dangerous than heading straight into the deepest north." Thomas looked at his group. "What do you all think?" David spoke first. "I say we keep going. We came this far. We survived the fortress. If we turn back now, we'll spend the rest of our lives wondering if we could have made it." Elena nodded slowly. "I agree. The South is gone. Even if we go back, there's nothing there for us. At least here, we have a chance." William, always the pragmatist, said, "I'll follow whatever the group decides. But I wanted to acknowledge that this is dangerous. We've been lucky so far. Luck doesn't last forever." Margaret met Thomas's eyes. "I think we keep going, but we do it carefully. We pay attention to Samuel's warnings, and we don't take unnecessary risks." Thomas exhaled slowly. The decision had been made, really, before they even asked the question. They had committed to this path weeks ago when they left the Southern Territories. Turning back now would mean admitting defeat, and none of them were ready for that. "We continue northeast," Thomas said. "Following Samuel's route, we avoid the deep north, and we stay together, no matter what." Samuel rolled up his map, handing it to Margaret. "Take this. It might help. And remember, if you see symbols carved into stone, pay attention to them. They're warnings. If you see lights beneath the ice, don't approach them. And if you hear sounds you can't explain, don't follow them." He stood, preparing his horse. "I'm heading south, back to the settlements, what's left of them. I hope you make it. I really do." Thomas shook his hand. "Thank you for the information, and for the company." Samuel mounted his horse, looking down at them one last time. "One more thing. If you reach the valley I marked, there's an old weather station there, abandoned but intact. It might offer shelter for the worst of winter. Look for a metal tower on the highest ridge. You can't miss it." He rode off without further words, disappearing into the gray morning. The group watched him go, then turned their attention to breaking camp.
Within an hour, they were mounted and moving again, heading northeast, following a route they hoped would lead to survival. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. They traveled during the brief periods of daylight, making steady progress across the plateau. The landscape began to change subtly, still mostly flat, but with occasional rises and falls, shallow valleys that provided temporary relief from the wind. The cold remained constant, but they grew more accustomed to it, their bodies adjusting to the environment through sheer necessity. They saw no signs of other travelers, no tracks, no smoke on the horizon. The north was empty in a way that felt both peaceful and unsettling. It was as if they had crossed into a world where humanity had never existed, where the land belonged entirely to ice and wind and silence. On the fourth day after leaving Samuel, they encountered the first boundary marker he had described, a cairn of stacked stones, deliberate in its construction, standing alone on a slight rise. Symbols were carved into the largest stone, simple shapes but clearly intentional. Margaret studied them carefully, comparing them to Samuel's map. "This marks the edge of a boundary zone," she said. "We need to skirt around it, not cross through it." They altered their course, giving the marker a wide berth. As they did, the temperature seemed to fluctuate slightly, growing warmer for a brief period before returning to its usual chill. It was subtle, but everyone noticed it. The boundary wasn't just symbolic, it was real, affecting the environment in ways they couldn't fully understand. That night, they camped farther from the boundary, choosing a spot with good visibility in all directions. The sky was clear, and the stars were brilliant. Elena took the first watch, and as she sat by the fire, she thought about Samuel's words. Consciousness without form. Thoughts that existed independently of bodies. It was a concept that felt alien and yet strangely compelling. What would it be like, she wondered, to exist without physical limitation? To be pure thought, moving through the world as light rather than flesh. The idea should have been terrifying, but instead it felt almost peaceful. She shook her head, pulling herself back to reality. Thoughts like that were dangerous.
They led down paths that didn't return to familiar ground. She focused instead on the practical details of survival, keeping the fire alive, watching for changes in the wind, listening for anything unusual. The night passed without incident. On the 7th day, they saw it, the metal tower Samuel had mentioned, standing on a ridge in the distance. It was still several miles away, but visible even through the haze of blowing snow. The sight of it lifted their spirits. Shelter, a place to rest properly, to recover from weeks of constant travel. They pushed harder that day, covering more ground than usual, driven by the promise of real protection from the cold.
By late afternoon, they reached the base of the ridge. The climb was steep but manageable, their horses picking their way carefully over rocky terrain that jutted through the snow. The weather station sat at the summit, a small compound consisting of several buildings clustered around the central tower. The structures were weathered but intact, built to withstand a harsh climate. Windows were shuttered, doors were locked, but with effort, Thomas managed to force one open, and they entered the main building. Inside it was dark and cold, but it was shelter. The wind couldn't reach them here. They moved through the rooms, assessing what was available. The station had been abandoned for years, but equipment remained. Scientific instruments, weather monitoring tools, furniture. Most importantly, there was a stove in the main room and a stockpile of fuel, compressed peat, coal, and wood preserved in sealed containers. Thomas lit the stove while the others explored the rest of the compound. There were sleeping quarters with bunks and intact bedding, a storage room with preserved food supplies, old but still edible, and a small library of journals and records detailing years of weather observations and research. For the first time in weeks, they had a real roof over their heads. The stove began to warm the main room, and the temperature rose noticeably. They removed their outer layers, feeling the cold gradually release its grip. It was almost disorienting, this sudden comfort after so long in the open. That evening, they prepared a proper meal using the supplies they found, supplementing it with their own provisions. They ate slowly, savoring the warmth and the relative luxury of sitting at a table rather than crouched on the frozen ground. Conversation returned, relaxed and easy, tensions easing for the first time since the fortress. David found a set of journals in the library and brought them to the table. "These are incredible," he said, flipping through pages filled with detailed notes and sketches. Whoever ran this station was documenting everything: weather patterns, wildlife, even geological changes. Margaret took one of the journals, reading through entries from decades past. The handwriting was neat and precise, the observations methodical. But as she read further, the tone began to shift. The scientist who had written the journal started noting anomalies, unexplained lights on the horizon, strange fluctuations in magnetic readings, sounds that didn't correspond to any known natural phenomenon. One entry caught her attention. Day 247. Observed luminescence to the northwest again tonight, pattern consistent with previous sightings, no explanation within current scientific framework, beginning to suspect there are aspects of this region that resist conventional understanding. Will continue monitoring. She read the entry aloud to the group. William frowned. How long ago was this written? Margaret checked the date. 1953.
Almost 70 years ago. Elena leaned forward. So the lights have been here for decades, maybe longer. David pulled out another journal, this one more recent. The entries were similar, but more concerned. The tone shifted from scientific curiosity to unease. The final entry, dated 1974, was brief. Instruments malfunctioning consistently. Compass readings unreliable. Recommend evacuation of station. This area is not safe for extended habitation. After that entry, the journals ended. The station had been abandoned, left intact but empty, preserved by the cold. Thomas stood, moving to a window. He looked out toward the north, where the horizon disappeared into darkness. Whatever's out there has been there for a long time, and people have been noticing it just as long. Margaret closed the journal. The question is whether we keep going. We have shelter here, supplies. We could wait out the worst of winter, then decide our next move. It was a sensible suggestion. The weather station offered everything they needed for survival. Staying would be the safe choice, the practical choice. But it also meant remaining static, uncertain, waiting in a place that previous occupants had abandoned for reasons they clearly documented. Thomas turned from the window. We rest here for a few days, recover our strength, then we keep moving. Staying too long in one place, especially one with a history like this, feels like inviting trouble. No one argued. They had all read the journals. They had all felt the subtle wrongness that clung to the compound despite its physical comfort. This was shelter, yes, but it wasn't home, and it never would be.
They spent 3 days at the weather station, using the time to rest, repair equipment, and plan their next moves. The building warmed gradually, becoming almost comfortable, though the cold never fully left. At night, temperatures plummeted outside, and they could hear the wind howling around the tower, but inside, near the stove, they were safe. David continued reading through the journals, piecing together a timeline of observations. The luminescence had been documented sporadically over decades, always in the same general direction, northwest. The scientists who had staffed the station had tried to investigate, sending out small expeditions, but none had returned with concrete answers. Most had simply encountered the lights from a distance and retreated. One journal described an attempt to approach the lights more closely. The expedition had lasted 3 days, covering approximately 30 miles. On the third day, they reached an area where the snow was discolored, faint blue streaks running through it, as if something had stained the ice from below. When they attempted to dig through the snow to investigate, the ground beneath was frozen solid, harder than normal ice, almost crystalline. They had taken samples but couldn't explain the composition. The entry concluded, "Recommend no further investigation."
This phenomenon exceeds our ability to safely study it with current resources. Margaret plotted the location on their map, comparing it to the route they planned to follow. "We're going to pass within 20 miles of where they encountered that discoloration, maybe closer." Thomas studied the map. "Can we go around?" "Yes, but it adds days to our journey, and we don't know how far the zone extends. It might be localized, or it might cover a much larger area than they realized." William spoke up. "What if we just observe it from a distance? Samuel said to avoid the lights, not to avoid the entire region. Maybe if we stay on the periphery, we'll be fine." It was logical but risky. They discussed it for hours, weighing options, considering variables. In the end, they decided to proceed with caution, sticking to their planned route but remaining vigilant. If they saw signs of the discoloration or the lights, they would alter course immediately. On the morning of the 4th day, they packed their gear and prepared to leave. The weather had stabilized, offering a brief window of clear skies. They took extra supplies from the station's storage, leaving behind a note in one of the journals documenting their visit and their planned route. It was a small gesture, but it felt important. If anyone else found the station, they would know that others had passed through and survived. As they rode down from the ridge, Elena looked back at the metal tower one last time. It stood alone against the gray sky, silent and patient, waiting for the next traveler to stumble upon it. She wondered how many people had sheltered there over the years, how many had read those same journals, faced those same decisions. The compound disappeared from view as they descended, and they returned to the open plateau. The cold greeted them immediately, sharper now after days of relative warmth, but they were rested, resupplied, and ready to continue. The journey resumed. The landscape began to change more noticeably as they traveled northwest. The plateau gave way to rolling hills, and patches of exposed rock appeared more frequently, breaking through the snow. In some places, the rock was dark, almost black, contrasting starkly with the white surroundings. In others, it had a bluish tint, similar to what the journal had described. They approached these discolored areas cautiously, never getting too close, observing from a distance. The blue rock seemed to shimmer slightly in certain light, as if it contained internal luminescence. It wasn't bright, just a faint glow, barely perceptible, but it was there, undeniable. Margaret dismounted near one outcropping, staying several yards away, studying it carefully. "It's not ice, it's definitely rock, but I've never seen anything like it." Thomas joined her. Could it be mineral deposits, something reflecting light in an unusual way? Maybe, but the journals mentioned hardness beyond normal stone, and that shimmer.
She trailed off, uncertain. David, unable to resist, moved closer. Margaret immediately called out, "David, stop! Don't touch it!" He stopped, frustration evident in his posture. "I'm just looking." "Look from here," Margaret said firmly. He retreated, rejoining the group. They mounted and continued, giving the discolored rock a wide berth. Over the next few days, they encountered more of it, scattered across the landscape in irregular patches. Each time they avoided it, sticking to areas where the snow and rock appeared normal. The lights appeared on the 8th night after leaving the weather station. They were far in the distance, on the northwestern horizon, exactly where the journals had indicated. At first, they looked like stars, but their movement gave them away. They pulsed, shifted, danced in patterns that no celestial body followed. The color was familiar,
the same blue-white glow they had seen beneath the ice in the fortress. The group stood together, watching in silence. The lights were beautiful in a way that felt both mesmerizing and dangerous. Elena found it hard to look away. And when she finally did, she had to consciously force herself to turn her head. "We don't approach them," Thomas said quietly. "We acknowledge them, and we move on." Everyone agreed. They set up camp with the light still visible on the horizon, but no one suggested investigating further. They had learned that lesson already. That night, the dreams began. Elena woke suddenly, her heart racing. She had been dreaming, vivid, strange dreams that felt more like memories than imagination. She was standing in a vast empty space, surrounded by blue light. She wasn't alone. Others were there, formless but present, communicating without words. The sensation was overwhelming, too much information flowing too quickly. She understood things she shouldn't understand, saw patterns she couldn't articulate. And then she was awake, gasping, the cold air of the tent shocking her back to reality. She sat up slowly, trying to shake off the lingering sensation. Across from her, Margaret stirred, also awake. "You too?" Margaret asked quietly. Elena nodded. "Dreams, strange ones." "Same here." They woke the others, discovering that everyone had experienced something similar. David described being submerged in water that wasn't water, breathing without lungs. William talked about seeing the world from above, as if he were flying, but without a body. Thomas had dreamed of lights speaking to him in a language he somehow understood, but couldn't remember upon waking. They sat together near the fire, processing what had happened. No one had been physically harmed, there was no immediate danger. But the experience had been unsettling, invasive even. It felt like the lights, even at a distance, had reached into their minds while they slept. Margaret pulled out Samuel's map, studying it by firelight. The journals mentioned this.
One of the scientists wrote about dreams after observing the lights. He described them as intrusions, not hostile, but persistent. Thomas stood, pacing. So the lights affect people even from a distance, through dreams. Or through sleep, William suggested, when our minds are less guarded. David, ever analytical despite his youth, asked, "What if the dreams aren't intrusions? What if they're attempts at communication? The lights reacted to us at the fortress. Maybe they're trying to reach us again." It was an unsettling thought. If the lights were intelligent and actively seeking contact, then simply avoiding them might not be enough. They would need to understand the rules of engagement, learn how to protect themselves beyond physical distance. Margaret spoke carefully. "When I was young, my grandmother told stories about the far north. She said there were spirits here that didn't think like people. They didn't have intentions the way we understand them. They just were. And if you got too close, you'd start thinking like them instead of like yourself. She said that was how people got lost. Not physically, mentally." The group absorbed this in silence. It aligned with everything they had experienced so far. The lights weren't predatory. They weren't evil. They were simply incompatible with human consciousness in ways that made prolonged exposure dangerous. Thomas made a decision. "We double our watches tonight, 2 people awake at all times, and we try to get as far from the lights as possible during tomorrow's travel. If we can put enough distance between us and them, maybe the dreams will stop." It was the best plan they had. They resumed their watches, now in pairs, keeping each other alert. The rest of the night passed without further incident, though no one slept deeply. The lights remained on the horizon, pulsing steadily, indifferent to human discomfort. By dawn, they were already packing camp, eager to move on. They rode hard that day, pushing the horses more than usual, putting miles between themselves and the northwestern horizon. By evening, when they stopped to make camp, the lights were no longer visible. Either they had traveled far enough, or the landscape had risen enough to block the line of sight. That night, the dreams did not return. Everyone slept normally, deeply, exhausted from the hard travel. It was a relief so profound that it almost made the previous night's experience worth it. They had found the boundary of the light's influence. As long as they stayed beyond it, they would be safe. The following days brought a gradual shift in the landscape. The hills grew steeper, and valleys appeared with more frequency. Rivers, frozen solid, cut through the terrain, their surfaces smooth and treacherous. They crossed several carefully, testing the ice before committing their weight.
moving slowly to avoid breaking through.
In one valley, they found ruins, old structures, not stone like the fortress, but wood and earth, collapsed and half buried in snow. They explored cautiously, finding little of value. The buildings had been abandoned long ago, stripped of anything useful. But the presence of ruins meant people had lived here once. That offered some reassurance. If others had survived in this region, perhaps they could too. Margaret found markings similar to the boundary cairns they had passed earlier. These were different, though, more detailed, almost instructional. She studied them carefully, comparing them to her accumulated knowledge of northern symbols. "I think these show safe routes," she said slowly, "paths that avoid the boundary zones." If she was right, it was invaluable information. They adjusted their course based on the markings, following directions left by people who had navigated this region before them. It felt like receiving guidance from ghosts, messages sent across time from those who had learned hard lessons so others wouldn't have to. The ruins became more frequent, scattered across the landscape like breadcrumbs. Some were simple shelters. Others were more complex, suggesting communities that had existed for years before being abandoned. They never found evidence of what had caused the abandonment. No signs of violence, no mass graves. People had simply left, walking away from homes they had built with care and effort. David found a journal in one ruin, tucked into a stone niche, protected from the elements. It was written in a language they didn't fully understand, but Margaret could piece together enough. It described a community that had lived in the valley for 3 generations, surviving through hunting and careful resource management. But over time, members of the community had begun disappearing. Not violently. They would simply walk off into the snow one day and never return. The journal's author attributed it to the lights, to the calling that certain people felt. Those who heard it became restless, distracted, increasingly drawn northward. Efforts to restrain them failed. They would wait until they weren't being watched, then leave, always heading toward the lights. The final entry was chilling in its simplicity. "Only 12 of us remain. We are leaving, going south. This place is not for humans anymore." The journal was dated 1897. Thomas closed it carefully, returning it to the niche where it had been found. "This confirms what Samuel said. People can't stay here. The North calls them, and eventually they answer." Margaret looked troubled. "We've already been exposed to the lights. What if we're already being called? What if we just don't realize it yet?" It was a question no one wanted to consider, but it hung over them as they continued their journey, an unspoken fear that every decision they made, every direction they chose, might not be entirely their own. Winter deepened. The days grew shorter, the darkness longer. They adjusted their travel schedule, moving during the narrow window of twilight that passed for daylight, resting during the long nights. The cold intensified, becoming something they felt in their bones, a constant ache that never fully went away even when they were near fires. They encountered no more lights on the horizon. The dreams did not return, but the sense of being watched, of being noticed by something vast and patient, never quite left. They moved through the landscape carefully, respectfully, as if walking through a place where they were tolerated but not welcome. Food supplies dwindled. Hunting was difficult. Game was scarce this far north, and what little they found was cautious, hard to approach. They supplemented their provisions with what they could scavenge from ruins, but those resources were limited. Rationing became necessary. Meals shrank. Energy levels dropped. William, the oldest among them, began showing signs of strain. He grew quieter, more withdrawn. His movement slowed. Margaret watched him carefully, noting the way he favored his left side, the slight tremor in his hands. The cold was affecting him more severely than the others. Age made you vulnerable in ways that will alone couldn't overcome. They found shelter in another ruin one night, a structure with most of its roof intact. They built a large fire, gathering close, and for the first time in weeks, Thomas broached the question they had all been avoiding. "We need to talk about what happens next. We're surviving, but barely. Winter is only going to get worse, and we don't know what we're moving toward anymore." David spoke first, his earlier enthusiasm tempered by weeks of hardship. "I think we need to find a place to settle, at least for the winter. Traveling like this constantly is going to kill us." Elena agreed. "There have to be more shelters like the weather station, places left behind by others. If we can find one with enough supplies, we could wait until spring."
Margaret nodded slowly. That makes sense, but we need to find it soon, before we're too weak to travel at all. William, who had been silent, finally spoke. His voice was rough, tired. I don't think I can keep going much longer. I'm slowing you down. You should leave me somewhere sheltered and move on without me. The group reacted immediately, overlapping protests filling the small space. Thomas crouched beside William, meeting his eyes. We're not leaving anyone behind. We stay together. That's not negotiable. William smiled faintly. I appreciate that. But be practical. If I collapse on the trail, I put all of you at risk. Better to plan for it now than deal with it in a crisis. Margaret moved closer, checking his pulse, examining his hands for signs of frostbite. You're not as bad as you think. You're exhausted. We all are. But we can manage this if we're smart. She looked at the group. We rest here for 3 days. We build up our strength.
Then we move in shorter stages, giving all of us, time to recover between pushes. It extended their journey, but it was the only humane choice. They agreed. The next 3 days were spent resting, eating as well as their rations allowed, and caring for minor injuries and ailments that had accumulated over weeks of travel. The ruin provided good shelter, and the large fire kept the worst of the cold at bay. On the second night, as they sat around the fire, Elena asked a question that had been building in her mind for days. Do you think we'll ever find what we're looking for? A place to settle permanently? Thomas stared into the flames. I don't know. Maybe. But I'm starting to think that survival isn't about finding the perfect place. It's about adapting to wherever you are, learning the rules, respecting the boundaries. Margaret added quietly, My grandmother used to say that the North doesn't reject people. It just doesn't make exceptions for them. If you follow its rhythms, if you understand what it's telling you, you can live here. But you can't force it. You can't try to make it into something it's not. David looked skeptical. That sounds like giving up, like accepting that we'll never really be comfortable here. Comfort is relative, Margaret replied. Our ancestors lived in places just as harsh. They survived. Some even thrived. Not because they conquered the land, but because they learned from it. The conversation drifted into silence, each of them lost in thought. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the ruin. But inside, the fire burned steadily, and the cold stayed at the edges rather than pressing in. It was enough. For now, it was enough. They resumed travel after 3 days, moving at a slower pace, stopping more frequently. William's condition stabilized, though he remained weaker than the others. They adjusted around him, carrying extra weight from his pack, helping him mount and dismount. It slowed them down, but morale improved. Knowing they would support each other through difficulty made the hardship easier to bear. The landscape continued to shift. Mountains appeared in the distance, their peaks snow-covered and jagged. Between them, passes suggested routes through rather than around. Margaret studied the terrain carefully, consulting Samuel's map and the symbols they had been following. One pass looked particularly promising, wide enough for horses, sheltered from the worst of the winds, with ruins scattered along its length that might offer rest stops. They altered course toward it, reaching the entrance after 2 more days of travel. The pass was everything Margaret had hoped, a natural corridor through the mountains, carved over millennia by glaciers and rivers. The walls rose on either side, providing protection from wind. Snow depth was manageable. It felt like a gift, a rare piece of luck in a region that rarely offered easy paths. They entered the pass cautiously, aware that natural corridors like this could become traps if weather turned bad. But the sky remained clear, and the wind stayed calm. They made good progress, covering miles without the usual struggle. That evening, they camped in a sheltered alcove where previous travelers had clearly rested before them. Stone fire rings indicated multiple groups had used the spot. Carvings on nearby rocks showed dates and names, people marking their passage, leaving evidence of survival. David added their marks, simple initials and a year, no elaborate message, just acknowledgement that they had been here, that they continued forward. It felt significant, joining a silent community of travelers who had walked this same path. The pass took 3 days to traverse. On the 3rd day, they emerged into a wide valley, sheltered by mountains on 3 sides. The valley was stunning in its stark beauty. Snow-covered fields stretched for miles, frozen rivers winding through them. And in the distance, structures. Not ruins, actual buildings, intact, with smoke rising from chimneys. They stopped at the valley entrance, staring in disbelief. David laughed, a sound of pure relief. There are people here, actual people. Thomas held up a hand, caution tempering excitement. Let's approach carefully. We don't know what kind of settlement this is. Not everyone will be friendly. They descended into the valley slowly, watching for signs of hostility. As they drew closer, details became clearer. The settlement consisted of about 20 buildings, arranged in a loose cluster near the river. Fields, currently frozen, suggested agriculture during warmer months. Livestock pens held animals, goats, sheep, even some cattle. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, indicating inhabited structures. People appeared as they approached, emerging from buildings to watch the newcomers. There were perhaps 30 individuals visible, dressed in furs and wool similar to what the travelers wore. They didn't raise weapons, but they didn't wave in greeting either. They simply watched, cautious, assessing. Thomas dismounted at a respectful distance, raising one hand in peace. We're travelers, from the south. We mean no harm. We're looking for shelter and possibly trade. An older man stepped forward, his beard long and gray, his eyes sharp. South? You came from the south, through the pass? Yes. The man studied them carefully, then nodded slowly. You're either very brave or very foolish. That pass closes in another week. You barely made it. He paused. My name is Henrik. This is our settlement. We don't get many visitors, especially not in winter. Thomas introduced himself and the others. Henrik listened, then gestured toward the buildings. Come, you can rest here tonight. We'll talk after you've warmed up and eaten. If you're staying longer, we'll discuss terms. But for tonight, you're welcome. It was more hospitality than they had dared hope for.
They followed Henrik into the settlement, leading their horses to a communal stable where other animals were kept. The warmth inside was overwhelming after weeks in the cold. Several people helped unsaddle the horses, working efficiently without much conversation. Henrik led the travelers to a large building that served as a communal hall. Inside, a massive fireplace dominated one wall, flames roaring, filling the space with heat and light. Tables and benches lined the room, and several people were already there, eating and talking quietly. Conversation paused as the newcomers entered, curiosity evident in every gaze. Henrik gestured toward an empty table. Sit, I'll have food brought. They sat gratefully, shedding outer layers for the first time in what felt like forever. The warmth was almost painful at first, their cold, numbed skin tingling as circulation returned. But gradually the discomfort faded, replaced by deep, profound relief. Food arrived: thick stew, fresh bread, hot tea. It was simple, but tasted extraordinary after weeks of limited rations. They ate slowly, savoring every bite, feeling strength return to their bodies. Around them, the settlement's residents gradually resumed their activities, though eyes still flickered toward the strangers occasionally. Henrik sat across from them, watching the meat. When they had finished, he leaned back, folding his arms. So, tell me why you're really here. People don't come north in winter without a good reason, or a bad situation driving them. Thomas met his gaze steadily. The south is gone. Plague. Cities emptied. Those of us who survived couldn't stay. We came north hoping to find something. Safety. A place to start again. Henrik nodded slowly. The plague. We heard about it. Traders brought word 3 years ago, before the routes closed. We didn't know it had gotten that bad. He paused. This valley is safe. We've been here for 5 generations. We know how to survive the cold. We know how to avoid the other things. Margaret leaned forward. What other things? Henrik's expression grew serious. You came through the pass. You must have seen signs. The lights, the ruins, the places where the land feels wrong. He gestured vaguely northward. This valley is protected. The mountains shield us from the worst of it. But beyond them, the north gets strange. We don't go there. We don't investigate. We respect the boundaries. Elena asked carefully, Have you lost people to the calling? Henrik's eyes sharpened. You know about that. So you've encountered the lights. It wasn't a question. He sighed. Yes, we've lost people. Not many. 2 in my lifetime. They felt the pull. We tried to stop them, but you can't hold someone forever. They left, walked into the mountains, never came back. He stood, moving to a window that looked out over the valley. That's the price of living this far north. We accept it.
We teach our children to recognize the signs, to turn away from certain directions, to avoid certain places.
Most of us live full lives here, but the North, it always takes a few. The group absorbed this in silence. The settlement had found a way to coexist with the strangeness, to carve out a livable space within the vast, inhuman North. It wasn't perfect, but it was survival. It was community. It was more than they had dared hope for. Thomas spoke carefully. "Would you allow us to stay? We can work. We can contribute. We're not looking for charity." Henrik turned from the window, considering. "That's not my decision alone. We have a council. They'll meet tonight to discuss it. But I'll tell you now, if you stay, you follow our rules. You don't go beyond the boundaries we've set. You don't chase curiosity into danger. And you accept that life here is hard. We survive, but we don't thrive. Not in the way southern cities used to." "We understand," Thomas said. "We're not looking for luxury. Just a chance to survive winter. Maybe more, if you'll have us." Hendrik nodded. "Rest tonight. The council will summon you in the morning. They'll decide then." He left them alone. The group sat in silence for a long moment, processing everything. Then quietly, David said what they were all thinking. "We might have found it. A place to stay." Margaret cautioned, "Don't get too hopeful. The council might refuse." But Elena smiled slightly. "Even if they do, we've proven we can survive out here, and we've learned the rules. That's more than we had when we started." William, who had been quiet throughout the meal, spoke softly. "I don't think I can travel much further. If they let us stay, I'm staying, regardless of what the rest of you decide." Thomas reached across, squeezing his shoulder. "We stay together. If you stay, we all stay." The decision felt right. They had come far enough. They had learned enough. And they had found, against all odds, a community that had mastered survival in a place that seemed designed to resist it. Outside, night fell completely, and the settlement's lights glowed warmly against the surrounding darkness. The mountains stood as silent guardians, holding back the strangeness beyond. And inside the communal hall, 5 travelers sat by the fire, finally allowing themselves to imagine a future that extended beyond the next day's survival. The council met the following morning in a smaller building near the center of the settlement. It was a simple structure, but its purpose was clear. This was where decisions were made, where the community came together to discuss matters that affected everyone. Henrik led the travelers there, and they waited outside while the council convened. Inside, 7 people sat in a circle, Henrik and 6 others, representing different aspects of the community. They discussed the strangers quietly, weighing risks and benefits.
The conversation lasted an hour, voices rising and falling, debates unfolding with the careful consideration of people who understood that poor decisions in the Arctic had consequences that extended far beyond discomfort. Finally, Henrik emerged. He looked tired but not unfriendly. "The council has decided. You may stay through winter. In spring, we'll reassess. If you've proven yourselves valuable to the community, you'll be invited to stay permanently." Thomas exhaled slowly. "Thank you. We won't let you down." Henrik continued. "You'll be assigned work based on your skills. We'll provide housing, food, and supplies. In exchange, you contribute labor and knowledge. We're especially interested in what you've learned traveling through the Northern Territories. Your experiences might help us refine our own understanding of the boundaries." Margaret nodded. "We'll share everything we know." "Good." Henrik gestured toward the settlement. "We'll show you your quarters. You'll share a building with 2 other families for now. It's cramped, but it's warm. Once you've settled, we'll discuss work assignments." The travelers followed him through the settlement, noting details they had missed in their exhaustion the night before. The buildings were well maintained, constructed from wood and stone, designed to withstand harsh weather. Gardens, currently buried in snow, were carefully laid out. A well, kept from freezing through constant use and insulation, provided water. Livestock were sheltered in barns built to trap animal heat. Everything was practical, efficient, designed for survival. Their assigned building was small but solid. Inside, a central fireplace provided warmth to 2 divided living spaces. They met the other families briefly. Quiet, cautious people who welcomed them with nods rather than words. Privacy was respected. Space was shared. It was communal living at its most basic, but after weeks in the open, it felt like luxury. They spent the day settling in, unpacking their gear, checking on their horses. The settlement's residents went about their work, occasionally glancing at the newcomers but not approaching unless necessary. It would take time to earn trust, to become part of the community rather than just temporary guests. That evening, Margaret was invited to meet with the settlement's elder, a woman named Astrid, who had lived in the valley her entire life. Astrid was in her 70s, frail but sharp-minded.
She sat near the fire in her small home, wrapped in blankets, and gestured for Margaret to sit across from her. "Henrik tells me you understand the symbols," Astrid said without preamble, "that you can read the old markers." Margaret nodded. "Some of them. My grandmother taught me." Astrid studied her carefully. "Good. We need someone who can interpret the warnings. Our last reader died 5 years ago. Since then we've been guessing." She pulled out a collection of drawings, symbols copied from stones around the valley.
"Can you tell me what these mean?" Margaret examined them carefully, tracing the patterns with her finger. "This one marks a safe path. This one warns of unstable ice. This one—" she paused. "This one indicates a boundary, something that shouldn't be crossed." Astrid nodded slowly. "That's what we thought, but we weren't certain." She pulled out another drawing. "And this one?" Margaret frowned. It was more complex than the others, layered with detail. "I'm not completely sure, but I think it's a record of time. Seasons, maybe, or cycles." She looked up. "Where did you find this?" "On the northern edge of the valley, near the pass that leads deeper into the mountains." Astrid's expression grew troubled. "We don't go there often. The boundary is close, but sometimes we need to check the markers, make sure nothing's changed." Margaret understood the implication. "You want me to go there, to verify that the boundary is still holding?" "Yes, in spring, when travel is easier. For now, you rest. Learn the settlement. Become part of us. But eventually, yes, we need someone who can read the warnings before we stumble into danger." It was a responsibility Margaret hadn't expected, but it made sense. The settlement survived because they respected boundaries. To respect them properly, they needed to understand them, and understanding required interpretation, knowledge passed down through generations, refined through experience. "I'll do it," Margaret said simply. Astrid smiled faintly. "Good. Henrik was right about you. You understand the North." Over the following weeks, the travelers integrated into settlement life. Thomas worked with the hunters, learning the valley's game trails and the best ways to track and trap in winter. David helped with equipment repair, his quick mind solving problems with tools and structures. Elena joined the women who managed food storage and preparation, learning preservation techniques that kept supplies viable through long winters. William, despite his age and fatigue, worked with the livestock, his calm presence helping to keep the animals settled during the coldest weather. Margaret spent her time studying the settlement's collected symbols and markers, building a more complete understanding of the boundary systems. She also began teaching others what she knew, ensuring that knowledge wouldn't be lost if something happened to her. The settlement had learned the hard way that relying on single individuals was dangerous. Redundancy was survival. As winter deepened, the settlement pulled tighter together. Communal meals became more frequent. Stories were shared around fires. Children played in the snow under watchful eyes. It wasn't an easy life, but it was stable, predictable, safe within its defined boundaries. The travelers began to feel less like outsiders and more like residents. Trust built slowly but steadily. They had proven themselves willing to work, to learn, to contribute without demanding special treatment.
That mattered more than words ever could. One evening, as they sat around the communal hall fire, Henrik joined them. "The council met again today. We've decided you don't need to wait until spring. You're welcome to stay permanently if you choose." Thomas looked at the others. No words were exchanged, but the decision was unanimous. "We choose to stay." Henrik nodded, a smile breaking through his usually serious expression. "Good. Welcome home." It was a simple statement, but it carried weight. Home. After months of travel, after weeks of uncertainty, after facing things they barely understood, they had found it. Not in the south they had fled, not in the empty wilderness they had crossed, but here, in a small valley sheltered by mountains, among people who understood that survival meant respecting what you couldn't control. Winter passed slowly, but without major crisis. The settlement's routines became familiar. Work was constant but manageable. The cold remained brutal, but the shelters held. Food supplies dwindled as expected, but careful rationing ensured no one went hungry. The community functioned through cooperation, each person contributing what they could, receiving what they needed. The travelers, no longer travelers but residents, learned the subtle rhythms of valley life. They learned to read weather patterns, to predict storms days before they arrived. They learned which tasks were urgent and which could wait. They learned the names of everyone in the settlement, their histories, their skills, their losses. David became particularly close with a young woman named Ingrid who worked in the settlement's small workshop. They spent hours together, talking about southern cities she had never seen, northern landscapes he was still learning.
It was a connection that felt natural, unforced, built on shared curiosity and mutual respect. Elena found purpose in teaching the settlement's children. Formal education was limited here, but she brought stories, history, knowledge from the South that enriched what the children already knew. They were eager learners, hungry for information about a world beyond the valley. William gradually regained strength. The combination of rest, regular meals, and purpose did what weeks of travel couldn't. He would never be as strong as he once was, but he stabilized, becoming a valued member of the community. His age and experience made him a natural advisor, someone younger residents turned to when facing difficult decisions. Margaret fulfilled her promise to Astrid. As spring approached and the weather permitted, she traveled to the northern edge of the valley with Henrik and 2 others. They checked the boundary markers, verifying that nothing had changed, that the warnings were still clear. The blue-tinged rock was there, visible in patches, but it hadn't spread. The lights, when visible on distant horizons, remained distant. The boundary held.
Standing there, looking northward toward the strangeness beyond, Margaret felt a mixture of emotions. Fear, yes, but also respect and gratitude. The North hadn't rejected them. It had simply asked them to acknowledge limits, to understand their place within a larger system they couldn't fully comprehend. Thomas found his role as a hunter satisfying in ways he hadn't expected. The valley provided enough game to supplement stored food, and the careful management of hunting territories ensured the population remained sustainable. He learned patience, observation, the art of moving through snow without disturbing it unnecessarily. Hunting here wasn't about conquest, it was about balance. As the days lengthened and the worst of winter released its grip, the settlement began preparations for spring. Seeds were checked and organized, tools were repaired, plans were made for planting, for rebuilding sections of fence damaged by snow, for expanding storage to accommodate future harvests. Life continued, not despite the harsh environment, but within it, adapted to its demands. One evening, as the group sat together in their shared quarters, Elena voiced something they had all been thinking. "We made it. We actually made it." David smiled. "We did more than make it. We found something worth having." William, staring into the small fire that warmed the room, said quietly, "I never thought I'd feel settled again. After everything that happened in the South, after losing so much, I thought survival was the best I could hope for. But this feels like more than survival." Margaret nodded. "It is. This is life. Different from what we knew, but real. Sustainable." Thomas stood, moving to the window. Outside, the valley stretched away under starlight, snow still covering the ground but less deep than before. The mountains stood as they always had, silent guardians holding back the unknowable north. "We were lucky," he said quietly. "We made good decisions, yes, but we were also lucky. A lot could have gone wrong." "But it didn't," Elena said firmly. "And we're here, and we're part of something that works." It was true. Against considerable odds, they had found not just shelter, but community. They had crossed through strangeness and survived not by fighting it, but by acknowledging it, respecting it, and choosing to live within boundaries that kept them safe. The North hadn't been conquered. It had been negotiated with. And in that negotiation, they had found a place where human life could continue, adapted and resilient, sustained by cooperation and respect for forces larger than themselves. Spring arrived gradually, not with dramatic warmth, but with subtle shifts. Days lengthened. Snow began to melt in patches, revealing frozen ground beneath. Ice on the river thinned, then cracked, then broke apart, flowing again after months of stillness. The settlement emerged from winter's cocoon, gradually expanding activities beyond mere survival.
Fields were prepared for planting. Henrik assigned teams to different tasks, some focused on breaking up frozen soil, others on repairing irrigation channels, still others on organizing seeds and planning crop rotations. The work was communal, everyone contributing according to ability. Thomas, David, and William joined the field teams, learning techniques specific to short growing seasons and cold climate agriculture. Margaret worked with Astrid, continuing to study the boundary markers and teach others their meanings. The knowledge was too important to remain with just 1 or 2 people. She created a simple guide, drawings and explanations that anyone could reference, and made copies to distribute throughout the settlement. It wasn't comprehensive, but it was a start. Understanding would build over time, through observation and experience. Elena helped prepare the communal gardens, smaller plots near the living quarters where vegetables and herbs were grown for immediate use. She learned which plants tolerated cold best, which required careful tending, which could be left largely alone once established. Gardening here required patience and acceptance that yields would be modest, but even modest harvests mattered when survival margins were thin. As the weather warmed, relatively speaking, the settlement began receiving visitors. Other communities existed in the surrounding valleys, isolated from each other during winter but reconnecting in spring and summer. Traders arrived first, bringing news, goods, and gossip from other northern settlements. The plague in the south was confirmed, its devastation complete. No one was returning. The north was becoming a refuge for survivors, population slowly increasing as more people fled northward. In exchange, they acquired seeds, metal tools, and information about conditions in neighboring regions. Thomas attended these meetings, learning the protocols, the unspoken rules that governed northern trade. Everything was about balance. You didn't take advantage because you might need generosity later. Trust was currency more valuable than goods. David continued his relationship with Ingrid, and by midsummer they had decided to marry. It was a simple ceremony, conducted by Henrik as settlement elder, witnessed by everyone. No elaborate decorations, no formal feast. Just acknowledgement of commitment, of two people choosing to build a life together. It felt more meaningful somehow than the grand weddings common in southern cities. This was stripped of performance, reduced to essential truth. The summer was brief, intense, and productive. Crops grew rapidly in the long daylight hours. Hunters ranged farther, bringing back game that had migrated north for warmer months.
Fish returned to the river, and nets were deployed to catch them in quantities large enough to preserve for winter. Work was constant, but morale was high. The settlement was thriving, and the new residents had become integral parts of that success. William, now fully recovered, began training younger residents in livestock management. He had decades of experience that proved invaluable. His methods were efficient, his patience endless. Children who might have been intimidated by others learned easily from him, drawn by his gentle demeanor and genuine interest in their development. As harvest approached, Elena suggested something the settlement hadn't had in years, a festival. Nothing elaborate, just a gathering to acknowledge the work completed, to celebrate survival, to reinforce community bonds. Henrik was skeptical at first, but Astrid supported the idea. "We work hard," she said simply. "We should also remember why. Community isn't just about survival, it's about living." The festival was planned for the harvest moon, when fields were cleared and storage buildings were filled. Everyone contributed: food, music, stories. The communal hall was decorated with woven grasses and late-blooming flowers. Tables were arranged, and for one evening, rations were expanded, allowing everyone to eat fully, freely, without calculation. The night of the festival was clear and cold, stars brilliant overhead. The settlement gathered in the hall, and for a few hours, hardship receded. There was singing, dancing, storytelling. Children ran freely, laughing. Elders sat together, sharing memories. Young couples, including David and Ingrid, danced awkwardly but joyfully. Thomas stood with Margaret near the fire, watching the scene. "This feels permanent," he said quietly, "like we're really building something that will last." Margaret nodded. "I think we are. Not because we've defeated the North, but because we've learned to live within it. That's more durable than conquest ever was." The festival continued late into the night, finally winding down as exhaustion claimed even the most energetic participants. People drifted back to their homes, tired but content. The settlement fell silent, sleeping deeply under cold stars. The second winter was easier than the first. Not because the weather was milder, it wasn't, but because the group now knew what to expect. They understood the rhythms, the challenges, the strategies for managing cold and darkness. They had become northern residents in more than just location. They thought differently, moved differently, prioritized differently. The travelers, now a year into their residency, had fully integrated.
Thomas served on the council, his experience and judgment valued. Margaret had become the settlement's primary interpreter of symbols, her knowledge expanding through careful study and field observation. Elena taught regularly, the children responding to her methods with enthusiasm. William managed livestock with quiet competence, his age now seen as an asset rather than liability. David and Ingrid, now married, had begun building their own small home on the settlement's edge, planning for a future that included children. No one spoke about returning south. That world was gone. This was home now, with all its challenges and limitations. But it was theirs. They had earned their place here, not through birthright, but through contribution, adaptation, and respect for the land that sustained them. One night, deep in winter's heart, the lights appeared on the horizon again. Not the same location as before, but close enough to be noticeable. The settlement responded as it always did, acknowledged them, watched them from a distance, made no attempt to approach or investigate. The lights pulsed their steady rhythm, visible for 3 nights, then faded. The settlement continued its routines, undisturbed. Elena, standing watch during one of those nights, thought about how much had changed since they first encountered the lights at the fortress. Then they had been terrifying, inexplicable, overwhelming. Now they were simply part of the landscape, another feature of northern life to be respected and avoided. Fear hadn't disappeared, but it had been supplemented with understanding. That shift felt significant. Spring returned, bringing the same patterns as before. Fields were prepared, seeds were planted, visitors arrived, trade resumed. Life continued its cycle, adapted to the constraints of the environment, but sustained by community effort. But this spring brought something new. Strangers, similar to how Thomas's group had arrived a year earlier. They emerged from the southern pass, exhausted and wary, riding horses that were near collapse. There were 4 of them, younger than Thomas's group, clearly unprepared for what they had encountered. Henrik met them in the valley mouth, as he had met Thomas. The conversation was similar, questions about origins, intentions, experiences. These newcomers had fled the south as well, seeking refuge from chaos and disease. They had heard rumors of northern settlements, of places where life continued. They had followed those rumors north, encountering the same strangeness, the same boundaries, the same tests of endurance. Henrik listened patiently, then made the same offer. You can stay through winter. In spring, we'll decide if it becomes permanent. Thomas, watching from a distance, felt a strange sense of continuity. They had been where these newcomers were now, desperate, uncertain, hoping for acceptance. And they had been given that chance. Now they were in a position to extend it to others. The cycle continued.
He approached the newcomers later, after they had rested and eaten. I know what you're feeling, he said quietly. A year ago, we arrived the same way, exhausted, uncertain, hoping this would work. One of the newcomers, a young woman named Sarah, looked at him with guarded hope. Did it? Did it work? Thomas smiled. Yes, but not because the North became easy, because we learned to respect it, to live within its rules. If you're willing to do that, you'll survive. You might even find something better than survival. Sarah nodded slowly. We'll try. That's all anyone can do, Thomas said. Try, learn, adapt. The rest takes care of itself. Over the following months, the newcomers integrated as Thomas's group had. They worked hard, learned quickly, asked questions. The settlement absorbed them, as it had absorbed others before, expanding slowly but sustainably. Growth was controlled, careful, never exceeding the community's capacity to support new members. By the time the second winter arrived, the newcomers were no longer new. They were residents, contributing members, part of the collective effort to sustain life in an environment that demanded constant vigilance and cooperation. Years passed. The settlement grew, but never dramatically. New residents arrived occasionally, most fleeing the collapsed South, a few coming from other northern communities seeking different opportunities. Each addition was carefully considered, evaluated not just for skills, but for attitude. The North didn't tolerate arrogance or recklessness. Those who survived were those who learned humility quickly. Thomas aged into a role similar to Henrik's, a leader through experience rather than formal authority. He understood the settlement's patterns, its needs, its strengths and vulnerabilities. He made decisions with input from others, always conscious that mistakes affected everyone. Leadership here wasn't about power, it was about responsibility. Margaret became the settlement's keeper of knowledge, maintaining records, teaching younger residents, expanding understanding of the boundaries that defined safe territory. Her work ensured that knowledge wouldn't be lost with any single generation. She trained apprentices, creating redundancy, building a system that would outlast her. Elena and William eventually retired from active work, age claiming strength they could no longer summon. But they remained valuable, teaching children, advising on problems, maintaining social bonds. The settlement cared for its elders, understanding that experience was a resource worth preserving.
David and Ingrid had 3 children, each born healthy despite the harsh environment. The children grew up knowing only the north, unable to imagine southern cities their parents sometimes described. To them, this was normal. The cold was expected. The mountains were familiar. The boundaries were simply facts of life, no more unusual than rivers or forests. The settlement developed traditions.
Annual festivals marked harvest and spring thaw. Stories were told and retold, creating shared history. Skills were passed down through apprenticeship and observation. A culture emerged, distinct from both the southern origins of many residents and the isolated northern settlements scattered across the region. It was something new, adapted to its specific location and circumstances. The lights continued to appear periodically, always on northern horizons, always watched from a distance, never approached. The settlement learned to interpret their patterns. Certain configurations preceded harsh weather, others suggested shifts in boundary locations. The lights weren't random. They followed rules, even if those rules weren't fully understood. Observation and experience gradually built a working understanding that kept the settlement safe. Trade networks expanded. More communities were discovered, connections established. Information flowed between settlements, improving survival strategies, sharing knowledge about boundaries, warning about dangers. The north remained harsh, but it was no longer entirely isolated. A loose network of human habitation had formed, each settlement independent but connected through trade, marriage, and mutual support. Thomas, now in his 60s, sat with Elena one evening, watching sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. They were old now, their bodies marked by years of hard living, but alive, surviving, thriving in ways they once thought impossible. "Do you ever think about the South?" Elena asked quietly. Thomas considered. "Sometimes, but it feels like a dream now, something that happened to someone else. I know what you mean. This is real. This is life." They sat in comfortable silence, watching light fade. Around them, the settlement prepared for evening, fires being lit, children called inside, animals secured. The routines were automatic now, performed without thought, efficient through repetition. "We did something good," Elena said finally. "Coming here, staying, building this." Thomas nodded. "We did. And others will continue it after we're gone. That's what matters. Continuity." The sun disappeared behind the mountains, and cold descended quickly, as it always did. But inside the settlement's buildings, warmth held. Fires burned. People gathered. Life continued, adapted but enduring, sustained by community and respect for the environment that surrounded them. Thomas died in his sleep during his 73rd winter. It was a peaceful death, the kind survivors hoped for. No pain, no struggle, just a gradual fading. The settlement mourned communally, acknowledging his contributions, telling stories of how he had led them through those first uncertain months. His body was buried in the settlement cemetery, marked with a simple stone carved with his name and years. Margaret followed 2 winters later, her mind remaining sharp until the very end. She ensured her knowledge was preserved, her apprentices trained, her records complete. The settlement lost a valuable member, but not the knowledge she had accumulated. That lived on through those she had taught. Elena and William passed within months of each other, their bodies simply giving out after decades of hard living. They were remembered fondly, their contributions acknowledged, their places in the community filled by younger residents who had learned from them. David and Ingrid lived longer, into their 80s, watching their children grow, have children of their own, continue the patterns established by those first difficult years. They saw the settlement expand, evolve, adapt to changing conditions. They saw new challenges faced and overcome. They saw life continue. When David finally died, he was surrounded by grandchildren who knew him only as an elder, who had no memory of the southern cities he occasionally mentioned, who couldn't imagine the journey that had brought him here. To them, he was simply grandfather, wise, patient, part of the settlement's foundation. Ingrid survived him by 3 years, spending her final time teaching the youngest generation stories and skills, ensuring continuity. When she died, the settlement honored her as they had honored others, with simplicity, respect, and acknowledgement of how individual lives contributed to collective survival. The children of those first travelers became elders themselves. Their children had children. Generations unfolded, each adding to the settlement's history, each facing challenges specific to their time, each finding ways to adapt and endure. The lights remained on northern horizons, mysterious and constant. The boundaries held.
the mountains protected, and in the sheltered valley, human life continued. Not easily, never easily, but persistently, sustained by community, cooperation, and respect for forces larger than themselves. The settlement thrived not through conquest of the environment, but through understanding its limits and living within them. It became a model other northern communities studied and adapted, its methods spreading through trade networks and visiting exchanges. And through it all, the story of those first 5 travelers, Thomas, Margaret, Elena, William, and David, was told and retold. How they had come from the south, fleeing collapse, how they had crossed strange lands, encountered things they couldn't fully explain, learned hard lessons about respect and humility, how they had found this valley and helped build something lasting. The story became part of the settlement's foundation, a reminder of origins, of challenges overcome, of the importance of community and adaptation. It was told to children around winter fires, to new arrivals seeking understanding, to anyone who wondered how this place came to exist. And each telling acknowledged the same truth. Survival in the North required more than strength or determination.
It required acceptance of limits, respect for boundaries, and willingness to adapt. Those who learned these lessons lived. Those who didn't? Well, the ruins scattered across the plateau told their stories silently. The settlement endured. And now, as we pull back from this story, as the settlement fades into the northern darkness, let yourself settle too. The journey is complete. The travelers found what they sought, not paradise, but survival, not ease, but purpose, not certainty, but a place where they could build something lasting within the constraints of a harsh environment. Their story isn't unique. Throughout history, people have migrated, adapted, survived against odds that seemed impossible. They learned to read landscapes, to respect boundaries, to live within systems they couldn't fully control. The specifics change, desert instead of ice, mountains instead of plains, but the core truth remains constant. Humans survive through flexibility, community, and respect for forces larger than themselves. The North in this story represents all extreme environments, places that demand humility, that punish arrogance, that reward patience. And the settlement represents what becomes possible when people accept those terms. Your own breathing has slowed now. The story has carried you through difficult terrain, through moments of tension and uncertainty, toward resolution and rest. That was intentional. Stories like this are meant to help you process your own journey through difficult times, to remind you that survival is possible, that communities can form even in harsh conditions, that adaptation is strength rather than weakness. As you drift toward sleep, if that's where you're headed, or as you return to your own life, if you're listening at another time, carry this with you. Every challenge has boundaries. Every difficult environment has rules. When you learn to respect those rules rather than fight them, when you build community rather than attempting isolation, when you adapt rather than demanding the world accommodate you, survival becomes not just possible, but sustainable. Thank you for listening. Thank you for journeying with these travelers through cold and strangeness toward warmth and community. If you enjoyed this story, if it helped you relax, if it gave you something to think about as you drift off to sleep, please subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this, quiet, contemplative narratives designed to help you find peace at the end of long days. Sleep well. And remember, even in the coldest, darkest places, communities survive through cooperation, respect, and the patient work of building something that will outlast any individual. That truth applies to frozen valleys in the far north, and it applies to wherever you are right now, facing whatever challenges feel overwhelming. You're more resilient than you realize, and you're not alone. Good night.